Welcome everybody to this learning speaker series. Today we have Dulce Orozco, who is speaking with us about self-compassion practice. This speaker series is part of a three-part speaker series that's happening this quarter called Collaborating with Compassion. You might have been part of our May speaker series, which was part of Mental Health Awareness Month, excuse me. And then we have another one coming up in July. So if you haven't caught our May speaker series, you can watch the recording and you can expect to see an invitation to our July speaker series soon. If you've never been to one of these sessions before, we start off with a conversation between me and Dulce. We have a couple of questions in the agenda. And after we go through those questions, we'll open up the conversation to questions from team members on the call. So if you have any questions that come up for Dulce as we're talking, you can feel free to add them to the bottom of the agenda. And I'll send the link to the agenda in the chat in case you don't have it open. I think that's all I have. So I'm going to pass it over to Dulce to introduce herself before we get started with the questions.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. It is so nice to be here. Thank you for having me. I appreciate each and every one of you for being here today. Thank you, Samantha. So I'm Dulce Orozco. I am a Latina immigrant therapist. My specialty is working with women of color in Massachusetts in individual therapy, helping them, putting themselves first, which is really challenging. And I also work with groups of people of color and offer workshops for people of color. That being said, I would love to start out our session with an invitation for you. So my invitation is for you to take some time and if any of you need some water, if any of you need a bite to eat, if you are hot and want to take your sweater off, if you're cold and want to look for a sweater or a blanket, do whatever you need to do to make yourself more comfortable. And I always try to remind myself and remind the people I work with to never underestimate the power of small movements. So if that tag is annoying you, you don't have to use that shirt. So please take some time to make yourself comfortable and we'll be here waiting for you. That would be my invitation.
Yeah, thanks, Dulce. That's so important. And I'm really glad we can start our call with that reminder. So yeah, thanks for that. Really looking forward to this conversation.
Awesome, me too.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll get started with this first question and then we'll move through the others. So if you aren't muted, if you could just mute yourself. Thank you. So this first question, can you share your definition of self-compassion?
Yeah, so I know that the word itself can be self-explanatory, but I think it's nice to do this at the beginning. So for many of us, we can be our worst critics, right? So we tell ourselves things that we wouldn't tell anyone because it's not nice and because most likely you'll get in trouble if you talk to others in the same way that you talk to yourself. So let's think about all that. And of course, it's not always, right? But if you picture someone you love, if you picture someone that you truly care for, let's think about all that love and respect and tolerance and all those good feelings that you have for them, making a U-turn. That's kind of like my favorite definition of self-compassion. So sending yourself all those good things that it's so easy for you to send to those people you love, and yet it can be so challenging for you to wish for yourself. Very briefly, there's three kind of like important elements to self-compassion. And again, I'm going to tell them briefly, but those three elements are mindfulness, So that awareness that we need, right, in order to say, you know what, this is a challenging time. I'm not being nice to myself, whatever that might be. So that's mindfulness. Then is common humanity. And it's the idea to keep in mind that suffering is part of a human experience, that even though we might not see it, other people, even if they're smiling, if we see them on LinkedIn, thriving, they're having problems too, because that's something that we can simply not avoid, the suffering of being a human. So that's called common humanity, to remember that we're all kind of like on the same boat. And then the third one, and probably I was going to say the most important, but they're all important, is self-kindness. So being able to do something nice for yourself, being able to actually incorporate the self-compassion element. So again, mindfulness, common humanity, and self-kindness.
Thanks. I'm glad that we defined that, especially for this conversation, and thinking about like what makes up self-compassion. I think it's really important to have in mind. So thinking about this definition of self-compassion, I'm wondering if we can talk about what are some ways that self-compassion practice might look like at work. And then also, how might these practices look specifically, or maybe look differently in an all remote work environment?
Yeah, so that invitation I extended to you, even though it might have sounded like, oh, I don't know what she's talking about, but that's self-compassion, right? Sometimes we might feel like, I don't know how to go about it. I don't have any formal practices of self-compassion. And I know that it can be very simple, but making sure that if you're thirsty, drink some water. If you've been sitting down for 3 hours, can you stand up and stretch? If you're hungry and you didn't have a chance to eat breakfast, can you take a 5-minute break? So self-compassion, when I first heard of self-compassion, it was in a conference, and Christopher Germer, who is a psychologist based in Massachusetts, I strongly recommend him. He's absolutely great. He said something that really stuck with me, and he said, if it's difficult, then it's not self-compassion. Self-compassion, it's easy. And I think we, especially at the beginning, get stuck on the logistics and on wanting to do it right. And we forget that it has to be easy. It doesn't have to be difficult, right? That being said, I would love to share with you very specific ways. So one of the ways that I think can be kind of like the opening door to self-compassion is asking ourselves the question, what do I need? Which goes back to what we were talking about before. And pay attention to the question. So it's not, what do I want? Because the answer might be different. It's definitely not anything that has a should in the sentence. So what do I need? And again, the answer might be something as simple as, I need to take a 5-minute break. And going back to your question about how could we incorporate these practices in an all remote work environment? So working at home has become, for many of us, these double-edged swords, right? So on one hand, yes, we're at home, but it's so hard to set limits, to stop working on time, to like separate your working space from the rest of your house. And then on the other hand, we have the, I guess, capability of making ourselves more comfortable, right? So even though self-compassion is definitely holistic, for those of you that are very rational like myself, I would love to offer different ways to get to the same destination, which is self-compassion. Is that okay, Samantha?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Great, thank you. So if we think about destination self-compassion, one way to get there could be using our bodies, right? It might be taking breaks, it might be stretching, it might be being comfortable, right? Like dressing comfortably. It might be breathing or plugging in, but really like plugging it into your schedule, like really intentionally practicing these things, right? It might be, again, using our body. So using our senses, using candles, using essential oils, using what can you do to make your working space the most comfortable way for you, what works for you. Now, if we look at, okay, destination is self-compassion. How can we use our minds to get there? Going back to the question. So one of the questions that we were using was, what do I need? Another question is, when you see yourself struggling, when you see yourself in need of self-compassion and you're working at home, or basically anywhere really, is asking yourself, what would I tell someone I really love that is going through exactly this situation? I know that many of you might have heard this question in a different setting, but chances are that that could be a way to practice self-compassion, right? Like just by, instead of focusing on you, what would you tell someone else that you love? Reaching out to someone if you need to is a way to practice self-compassion. You don't have to do it on your own. Reaching out to a team member, reaching out to a therapist, reaching out to whatever it is that where you can get that support, right? And be mindful on how we talk to ourselves. That can be another way in which we know, okay, I might be needing some of this. So we talked about the body, we talked about the mind, and if we do it holistically, it would be being aware and sticking to our schedules, right? So setting limits, especially when working at home, meditating, doing self-compassion exercises. And for those of you that have a spiritual practice, even incorporating some things like oracle cards, or again, you can make it your own. You can have fun with self-compassion. I would invite you to be as creative as you can be. And these are some ideas, but there's absolutely no limit.
Yeah, I love these ideas too. And it was making me think, especially the mental practice that you brought up, the question about like, what would I tell someone that I love that's going through this exactly same situation? We have a sub value at GitLab that's called assume positive intent. And I think that almost always, at least when I hear it, it's talked about assuming positive intent in others. And it just makes me think that like, if we can like assume the same intent for ourselves when we need to take time to practice self-compassion, I think that it's important to, I just wonder how we could like challenge ourselves within the company to use that idea about positive intent when we're talking about ourselves, not just other people too.
And it starts with each of us, right? It's kind of like, well, how can you make it your priority? Which I think intentionality and prioritizing this, it's a big part of it. Yeah. So, because it's almost like going against our default, which is being tough to ourselves, like that negative self-talk. So it's almost like going against.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Great. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
So let's move on to this next question. And I'd love to talk about how our individual identity and the groups that we're a part of, how does that influence our ability to practice self-compassion?
Yeah, so it definitely does in a big way. Speaking for myself as a Latina and as an immigrant, I was born and raised in Venezuela, and I came here when I was 17. And after working with so many other immigrants and people of color, I would say that one of the reasons why self-compassion was so impacting for me was because it was almost as, I would say that it was the first time I've heard, well, there's another way. Like you can achieve even better results if you're nice to yourself, right? And I would also say that it's not easy for us to practice it, because it's going back to what I was saying a few seconds ago, it almost goes against what we learn. So for many people of color, it's all about you have to suck it up, right? Like you have to prove them wrong, you have to be strong. So there might be a lot of resistance when someone tells you, well, what if there was another way? What if you don't have to do any of that and you can do even better for yourself? So I would say that the identity plays a huge, huge role into all of this. Many times people ask me what theoretical approaches I use. And even though self-compassion by itself is not a theoretical approach, I think it's the tool that I use the most. I actually, not too long ago, just put together this online tool for women of color, and it's called Remember That You Are Already Doing Enough, because I feel that for many of us, we have this tendency to always overcompensate, right, without even knowing it. So self-compassion can definitely be this thing that tells you, or that guides you, or that supports you. But it's really hard for us to give ourselves permission to even try it, because it might be seen as a sign of weakness, as a sign of laziness. But what if I do this? Would that make me look, I don't know, like lose all my talents? Or so there's many misconceptions about it.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think that that part is so important in this conversation about self-compassion at work, recognizing that each of us comes with a different experience that influences the way that we can or can't pick up these practices and apply them at work. And so remembering that as we're working with people around the world and people that live nearby us that have such a different experience, I think is really important. So
yeah, and that there is a way for each of us to make it our own, right?
Yeah.
So what works for you might not work for me. What worked for me yesterday might not work for me today, but that doesn't mean that I can find my own way to adapt it and make it work with whatever it is, the resources, how I'm feeling, the energy I have. So it can really have a positive impact.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Dulce. So I have one more question, and then we'll move on to the team member questions because there's a few in the doc already. I would love if we could talk about what are some signals or behaviors that managers should watch for to recognize behavior in their direct reports and within themselves that indicates a need for self-compassion. And then what actions can managers take when they notice this need in their people?
Awesome. So let me just warn you that none of this are going to be unfamiliar to you, but yet it's looking at it through the lens of self-compassion, right? So I would say overwork. Yes, we know that sometimes there's timeframes and projects that need to be done, but if you see your team or one person in your team staying late every single day, that's kind of like a red flag. Being a perfectionist, and from a business perspective, I can understand how a manager might be like, oh, it's awesome to have someone that does such a great job. At the same time, that can really hold people back, and even your whole team back, right? When people might not be able to reach their full potential to be really creative because they need to be perfect. Another red flag, for a lack of a better term, or another indicator might be showing up to work sick. So many of us, maybe that's what we saw growing up, right? Maybe we saw our parents showing up to work, even if they were extremely sick. Would it be okay if I share a personal story with you about this one?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you.
So absolutely. So back in January, I have two daughters. My then 5-year-old daughter tested positive for COVID, and she was having symptoms. And my younger one and myself, we were having symptoms, but our tests were negative. I don't know if any of you can relate with this, but for me, it was so difficult to give myself the time, even when my body was telling me, hey, you're sick. I was trusting this little piece of paper more that said, no, you're not, right? So that was definitely an indicator of needing self-compassion, because it's not listening to our bodies. It's not trusting our bodies. So that's definitely a part of it. Another one is paying attention to the words we use. So we were talking about the self-narrative, right? And the negative self-talk. And words can be so powerful. So pay attention to that. Many times there's this almost like things that we say on autopilot. Oh, that was so stupid of me, or things like that might seem little, but yet they could be an indicator of self-compassion. From a business perspective, I understand there are certain words that need to be used, right? But is there any way we could pay attention to the words we use? From my experience working in community mental health settings, I know that there's such a big emphasis in productivity, to the point where it's so easy to connect your worth as a person, as an employee, with your productivity. So is there a way in which we can pay attention to this? So definitely pay attention to the words we use. Another one is, are people using vacation? Is your team utilizing the vacations the time off that they already have? I have this monthly group with a group of Latinx employees, and back in May, we try to do a monthly challenge. Our May challenge was to take your calendar and actually blocking time off, because that's the other thing. Many of us, even if we have the intention and even if we still want to do it, if we wait until the last minute, it might be too late, right? There's things that you cannot move around, things that you cannot reschedule. So that's another indicator. And the last one is, and there's many more, but for purposes, time purposes, right? But be in alignment. And what I mean by that is, so as managers, if you really want people to feel respected and to feel that, yes, you're aware of their schedules, do you need to send them an email on a Saturday evening? Or many of the times the feedback I get is, Dulce, it's great that the company offers all these tools, but then we feel that we are being quote unquote punished if we showed up instead of being working. So be in alignment with those things, right? With your values and all of that. As for the actions to tell, I would say walk the walk, right? I know it's one of those things, it's so easy to say, but actually, can you be that role model? Going back to the U-turn, it might be so much easier for you as a manager to be compassionate towards other people, to be, encouraging your team members. Oh no, you should take them off. Like if you're having a whatever in a work, like a family emergency, go take care of that. And at the same time, and these are stories that I've heard from others, right? You can be a great manager in that way, and you might show up to the office the next day after having surgery and don't see that as a problem whatsoever. So really try to be that role model, right? Remind people of the resources that the company already has. In my experience, there's many resources that are underutilized because we don't know about them. So just try to remind people. As a manager and as a staff, I would say make suggestions. Chances are, if you've noticing these things, most likely there's someone else that might be also having similar issues. So make suggestions and feel free to say, listen, I think that we could use more of this. Also use your employee resource groups or like make suggestions to them. And Samantha, there's so many free resources out there that something that might look as little or as simple as making a Google document where everyone can plug in different videos, TED Talks, podcasts that they use, something like that. It doesn't have to be complicated. Again, remember, if it's hard, it's not self-compassion. That's kind of like a mantra that I like to remember.
This is really excellent. Thank you so much for sharing so many just like real examples that I think even if people have heard some of them before, hearing them in a new way, or maybe hearing something new, to walk away from this conversation and think like, okay, I as a manager can check in with this with my team this week, or I as an individual contributor can check in with myself on this week. I think, thank you for going through all of this. This is really excellent.
Yeah, and start out with yourself, right? No matter if you're a manager, no matter what your position is, just start out with yourself.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Thanks so much, Dulce. This was great.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm gonna transition us over to our team member questions, and Amanda has the first one, and I see her on here. So Amanda, you wanna verbalize?
Hi, Dulce. Thanks so much for this. It's really helpful. I was wondering if you have any tips for how I can teach my children to practice self-compassion. I'm always trying to redirect their negative thoughts, but I have an older son who's 11 who just kind of rushes to, I have a project, I know I'm going to do bad, that kind of thing. So I try to tell him to focus on the positive, but I don't think I'm using all the right words. So any tips you could provide would be helpful.
Hi, Amanda. Thank you for your question. So I have a 6 and 4-year-old. My 6-year-old is quite a perfectionist. She last year, she just finished kindergarten. She was getting ready for kindergarten on a Zoom thing, and they needed to do a self-portrait. And she cried, she made me look for a picture of herself. She was crying, right? And I was like, no, you're doing great. And she was like, do you really think I have one eye here and the other eye here? So she was crying. And then it's hard, it's really hard, right? So I know we're talking about very different ages. Going back to the role modeling, going back to that, I do think that we really underestimate as moms, when I don't know, like, oh, I'm so stupid, I forgot this. Or even the other day I was getting a bathing suit, and I went with my 4-year-old, and I was like, oh, I look horrible in this, right? Without realizing that I'm saying it out loud. And she was like, Mommy, you look beautiful. Your belly looks so nice. I'm like, thank you. And yeah, so I could not emphasize enough the part of being that, like, being really aware of how you're treating yourself, how you're doing it with yourself. I think one thing that you can do together, or that even he could do himself, is breathing exercises. We try to do that. The ones I have are super like simple, like smell the hot chocolate, blow the hot chocolate. So you might want to look into more age appropriate ones, right? Mine are too basic. Affirmations are really cool too. There's different apps, but there's one called Insight Timer. I don't know if you've heard of them. It's awesome, and you might want to check that out. And I would say, Amanda, try to practice it at the beginning with him, not making it a big deal, right? Like, oh, listen, I've heard of this. Why don't we do it together, without really like putting a lot of pressure. But I would say breathing exercises, affirmations, and most importantly, being that role model to him, which I think it's really the beginning and the foundation to everything. And I can share my email in the chat, and feel free to email me, and I'll be happy to share more resources with you.
Thank you so much. This was really helpful. And I think that I haven't really paid attention to my own out loud self-talk when I'm around them. So that's a really good tip, because it's so easy to just slip because
Absolutely.
yeah.
Especially if we were not taught,
Yeah.
right? Like as adults, that's the other thing. And I think that's why it's so important for moms, aunts, godmother, teachers. I think that we should be learning about this in preschool. So it's a skill. So when we're adults, it's not weird to treat ourselves nicely because you've been doing it all along. It's something that you've been practicing and you've progressively gotten better at, instead of saying like, oh, this is so uncomfortable, I don't know how to do it. And yeah, I don't want, like, I just can't.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful.
You're very welcome.
Thanks, Dulce. It looks like James has the next question. Are you on, James?
Yeah. So yeah, I wanted to ask, I'm learning about self-compassion, and then my fear is be too soft on yourself and you don't perform. Like sometimes you need to be hard on yourself. So I imagine it as changing your inner monologue to be like a more effective coach, which makes sense. Coaches are compassionate, but they're also hard sometimes. Can you talk to me about the balance of that?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because there's been many studies about self-compassion. So it's one of those things where back in, and this is, on one hand, this is based on Buddhism, right? So on one hand, we're talking about something that we're adapting. So the founders of self-compassion are Christopher Germer and Christine Neff. If you want to check them out, they're both absolutely wonderful. And they say, so on one hand, this is adapted and inspired from Buddhism. So this is so old. But then on the other hand, of course, they made adaptations around it, right? And throughout the years, it's become such a, I think it's because we need it so much that it's been very formally studied. So there's tons of studies and evidence that, because so many of us, James, have that fear, right? Or that worry that you're talking about. But wait, if I'm being nice to myself, would that make me, filled in the blank? Is that going to make me weak? Is that going to make me lazy? Is that going to make me not achieve the results I want? And to summarize that, and again, if you want to write me an email, I'll be happy to look into more specific results with you. But to summarize that, what they found is that it actually does the opposite. So it creates the opposite effect. Because when we can be compassionate towards ourselves, we become more resilient. When we can be more compassionate towards ourselves, we can get access to that creativity, to that forgiveness that we have, so we can tap into resources that, even though have been there, we might have not have access to in the past because of this quote unquote core beliefs, right, that we learn from society about this. It's better, kind of like getting ready for the worst, or I have to be tough with myself, suck it up, all these things. So think about it this way: when you practice self-compassion, it's like having access to all of these extra resources that will make you even better, that are already in you, but that for some reason you did not have access to. Does that kind of answer your question, James?
It does, but I feel like I often take it too far. Oh, I'm pretty tired. Yeah, I should sleep in. Oh, I should go to work. Actually, work is meaningless. Life is meaningless. Connections are meaningless. Nothing matters. So just sleep. You don't really need the money. You don't really need the job, but it's in opposition to the person I want to be.
And I would say with self-compassion, right? I think it's one of those things, and this is based on my personal experience. And this is also based on the fact that I can be extremely rational, a little too much. So I would say, based on those two things, I feel that with self-compassion, one thing is to think through it, but another thing is to feel it. So I would say to give yourself the chance to practice some of the exercises and then see, not necessarily through all those rationalizations that are going to get there, but with how you're feeling about it. And I know that just that by itself can be kind of like challenging for someone rational like myself, and maybe you, or maybe some other people. But I think that the door to self-compassion sometimes is that, right? It's not necessarily our thoughts, but how do we feel about it? Going back to, if it's hard, it's not self-compassion. And even I would add, if you're thinking about it too much, that's not necessarily self-compassion, because then we're tend to rationalize it and look for explanations and look for all these things. But I can see what you're saying, because I can identify with that, especially at the beginning.
Thanks, Dulce.
Yes. And there's so much research. Again, I think that maybe like tapping into a little bit of that might give you the motivation and the permission to check it out.
Yeah, thanks. Looks like we have one more question from Alexander.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you for the great talk. I was wondering if you had any advice for practicing self-compassion around making past mistakes. I often find myself dwelling on like, oh, I said that thing that felt bad that I now realize was unskillful, or oh, I hurt that person's feelings. This feels bad. Could you talk a little bit about that, please? Thank you.
So there's two that come to mind, and I'll be more than happy to share with Samantha some links, so you can get access to audios with these two exercises. So there's two that come to mind. One is called the self-compassionate break. And basically is, and this is recommended, Alexander, and thank you for your question, by the way, but this is recommended for things that, yes, so it's something that is painful or that is taking some of your peace away, but it's not super, super traumatic, right? Or super, super difficult to deal with. So I would say something that is not quite on the, I don't know, like a 10 on a 0 to 10 scale, right? So it's based on those 3 different components of self-compassion. And basically what you do is you take a break and you go through each of them. So the first one is mindfulness, and it's when you realize, oh, here I go, I'm thinking about this again. So you're recognizing that you're doing it. The second one is common humanity. And the invitation is for you to come up with a phrase that remind you, you know what, this happens to all of us. Even though, and if you want to like even make it a little more, like expand on it a little bit more, you can say, even though it might feel that it's just me going through this, we all go through this as humans. So it's that element of common humanity, reminding yourself that it's part of the human experience, right? And then the third one is the self-kindness. So this is when, and this is the most challenging part, because this is when you part of that break is taking care of yourself. So it's so easy for us to say, you know what, I'll get to that at the end of the day, on the weekend, I'll do that thing. But part of in order for the self-compassionate break to work, you need to do it right then and there. And it can be something as simple, by the way, another way to practice self-compassion is through touching. So it's proven that our bodies respond to our touch, right? So even something as simple as putting your hands on your chest and say something nice to yourself, right? Like, I'm going through a difficult time, it's gonna get better. Practicing a loving kindness or metta by saying, may I be peace, may I be, whatever it might be. So going to doing something nice for yourself, like taking a tea, right? Grabbing some essential oil, but doing it right then and there. It doesn't have to be complicated, but it's making sure that you're applying that element of self-kindness. So mindfulness, common humanity, and self-kindness. Do I have time to share another one, Samantha?
Yeah, we still have about 3 minutes. Go for it.
Awesome. So the other one is called soften, soothe, aloud. And it kind of like thinking about that one thing that happened, right? So it would be, the first part of that is soften. So is where in your body are you feeling this? And really trying to connect with your body. Let's say that you realize you're feeling that you're feeling it a lot on your chest. So soothe, right? How can you soothe yourself? How can you soothe that feeling? If you could even picture that feeling in your body, how could you take care of it, right? And allow, which is something that so many of us are almost trained consciously or unconsciously to do the opposite, which is distract ourselves, ignore it, don't look at. But here you're saying, you know what, I'm going to allow this to happen because I know that it will pass. And maybe even incorporating a mantra or something that helps you. I use a lot of visual reminders, sticky notes, lots and lots of visual reminders. And I know that for some people, it's like, oh, I don't know about that. But actually having that something in front of you might be helpful. So those are 2 ways. There are many more. And again, I'll be happy to share with Samantha some of the links so you can have access to these audios. Some of them are not long. They're like 6 minutes. And at the beginning, it's really helpful for us to have that guidance. But over time, hopefully we can get to a point where we make it our own and we adapt it, and it doesn't have to be that long.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dulce. I have never heard of either of these practices, and I'm really grateful that Alexandra asked this question because this is really great. We're just
And
at-
even,
oh, go
oh,
ahead.
sorry, Samantha, but I was gonna
Yeah.
say, if you don't have the time, if you're, if you forget about it, even something as simple as asking yourself, what do I need?
Mm.
Right? What do I need? And what I might need right now is calling someone I love and just hearing that voice. Or what I might need right now is listening to that favorite song that always calms me down. So again, remember that it doesn't have to be complicated. These are just two very elaborate exercises, but it doesn't have to be complicated whatsoever.
Yeah, thanks for that reminder. And I love how you kept repeating during this conversation that if it's hard, then it's not self-compassion. I think
Yeah,
that that's a really
absolutely.
a great takeaway from this conversation. So thank you. Yeah. Well, Dulce, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for coming to speak with our GitLab team. I'm going to share the recording once it finishes processing, and I'll share it with you, and I'll share it with anyone who wasn't able to attend this conversation live. But again, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And I hope that everyone here has a great rest of your day, and that everyone takes a moment to practice self-compassion today if you can. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and I appreciate so much each of you for being here. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Thanks, Dulce. Have a good one, everyone. Bye.